Hi everyone, welcome back to English 247. This is for class for Tuesday, the 28th of May. And last class, what I did was I reviewed the syllabus and the course outline. So if you have any questions about the class, please let me know. And I had you upload a brief introduction about yourselves. As you know, you're not required to respond to your classmates, but you are required to read their responses and my responses in turn. You can see that I responded to each of you. I thought I'd tell you a little bit about myself. And for me, it begins in New York City, where I was born and raised. I attended college, however, in upstate New York, the University of Rochester, that advertised itself as a place where students would experience, quote, real winters, unquote, which sounded quite romantic to me. Obviously, real winters aren't always romantic, as I learned. I majored in English, not surprising, minored in psychology so I could prepare to go to law school. And obviously, my career plans changed, as oftentimes happens when you're in college. I fell in love with literature, and I realized that I didn't want to devote my career to law, but to literature instead. So I applied to graduate schools and eventually decided on UCLA, which is on the West Coast. So we wouldn't have any real winters there. We had earthquakes and other weather issues, but we didn't have real winters. I focused on Shakespeare and his contemporaries. And then when I finished graduate school, I began my teaching career and realized that I wanted to come home. And for me was home would qualify as anything on the East Coast. So I began applying to positions, and there was a small school that was in Western Massachusetts by the name of Greenfield Community College. So you know how the story ends. And I had never been to Western Mass, but I've been to Eastern Mass. And I interviewed for the position, and we talked a bit about what my transition might be like from sunny California. But I was assured that the winters here in Western Massachusetts are not that bad. And I packed up my belongings and I started in the 1993-94 school year. Hard to believe how many years have gone by since then. And I can tell you it was a historically significant year because it broke most of the existing weather records for cold and ice and snow. So it was a truly challenging year, and I was completely unprepared. But I've stayed throughout all kinds of winters. The last few winters have been relatively mild if you've been in New England for the last few years. And I mostly teach English classes, but I also teach public speaking, personal communication skills, and I also teach a communications class in media and popular culture. So I teach a little bit of everything. So that's my story. So when I reviewed the syllabus and the course outline, I didn't have a chance to talk about plagiarism. So I wanted to talk about that today and then talk about two readings that I'm hopeful that you were able to do prior to viewing this video, though I'm aware people are still adding and dropping classes and getting a hold of texts and so forth. But ideally, you would have already read the essay that I had assigned, The Cult of True Womanhood, and I had given you a link last class on where to find that, as well as a short story, The Story of an Hour, which is included in the Kate Chopin textbook that I ordered for class, but I also had provided a link for that reading as well. But in terms of syllabus, or in terms of our syllabus, the section on plagiarism reads, plagiarism is defined by the Modern Language Handbook, 4th edition. That's known as the MLA. I hope that sounds somewhat familiar to you from previous English classes because that is the organization that determines basically the conventions that you follow when you're writing in the humanities. And their definition of plagiarism is, quote, using another person's ideas or expressions in your writing without acknowledging the source, unquote. And then following that in parentheses is the page number for where you can find that quote. And then an ending punctuation, which is pretty standard of how you quote something from a book. And the message I have is do not plagiarize in your papers or writing. Plagiarism can result in stiff classroom penalties and may also lead to college disciplinary action. And basically, I would just tell two quick stories to encourage people not to plagiarize. One actually happened to me early in my teaching career. I'm reading papers, and this was pre internet, and something sounds familiar to me, and I'm trying to determine where I'd read this before. Again, I couldn't go onto the internet to do a database search, but what I was able to find out fairly quickly was that I didn't need to think very hard or long about this, because the reason why it sounded familiar is because the text was directly taken from our college textbook that I had assigned for class, with a few minor mechanical errors. Perhaps they were hopeful that if there were a few errors, I might not suspect plagiarism. The better story occurred around the same time period, but did not occur to me. It appeared in all the academic newspapers. So, yes, there is a thing as academic newspapers. A middle aged professor, that part's important, in the late 80s, early 90s, is reading a paper and realizes that it sounds familiar. Again, pre internet, can't refer to sources, and to try to determine where that text originally appeared. And as the professor contemplated, where have I read this before, he realized he hadn't read it before. He had written it. It was one of his old college papers that he had submitted decades earlier as a college student. And somehow, some way, it had found its way into the hands of one of his current students. I believe it has something to do with a fraternity that was recycling papers. And plagiarism is pretty serious. If you get caught plagiarizing, at the very least, you could fail the assignment. But at the very most, you could be expelled with a notation on your transcript that you plagiarized. And that was pretty much my plagiarism speech. But as you know, the world has changed rather dramatically in the last year and a half, with artificial intelligence. And I encourage you, at least in this class, not to use artificial intelligence. And I wanted to give you my reasoning why. And the first is that I still believe in the idea of reading and writing for learning's sake. So that if you really want to improve your reading and your writing skills, that you would do it yourself rather than rely on an outside source. It's one of the reasons why our academic papers over this semester will be critical papers, where I won't be asking you to use outside sources. I'll be asking you to refer to your own ideas. So that's the first. The second is that artificial intelligence has been found to make mistakes. One of the ways they've described this is hallucinating, which I think is somewhat problematic, because that assumes that there's some sort of intellect or self-awareness, which is a whole other problem when it comes to artificial intelligence. Anybody who's ever seen some of the science fiction movies of the past about things of this very nature, such as The Terminator, will know exactly what I'm talking about. You certainly don't want to be citing incorrect information. And it was just a few months ago where an attorney, of all people, did just that, using artificial intelligence to cite court cases in his legal brief, and it was determined that none of those court cases had existed. And then, of course, there's just the ethics of it, of whether or not artificial intelligence is really just a higher form of plagiarism, in that it is compiling the ideas of people previously. Anybody who is an artist knows some of the difficulties associated with artificial intelligence using one's artistic work in order to produce works for others, and how questionable that is. So if you put all of these things together, I would suggest that, at least for this class, that especially because we're working with texts from the 1800s, that we put ourselves in the place of what an 1800s audience would have experienced when they were reading these texts. They would have read them on their own, and they would have written about them and discussed them on their own. So that's my little speech about artificial intelligence. So moving forward, and I did try to incorporate within the class itself incentive not to use artificial intelligence or other resources, because if you'll remember the grading scheme, 25% is answering those attendance questions that I have at the end of these videos. And you'll soon see that these attendance questions are deliberately constructed to not have right or wrong answers. I'm more interested in your reasoning than I am in the answer. And as long as you respond, you receive credit for that. And secondly, you are able to rewrite the first paper for a higher grade. So I see the first paper as a kind of learning exercise. While the second paper, you may not have an opportunity to rewrite it because it's due at the ending of the semester. There is the possibility that if you were able to hand it in early enough that we could perhaps negotiate a revision. But that's something we would have to negotiate. It's not guaranteed the way it would be guaranteed with your first paper. And your final exam is open book, open notes. It's not an examination on memorization. It's an examination in the understanding of concepts and synthesizing ideas. Really, the best way to prepare for that final examination is to do all the readings, watch all the videos, answer all the attendance questions, and read your peers' responses and my responses in turn. And if you do that, you'll be very well prepared. So, in terms of beginning the semester, I thought it might be useful to have a little bit of a historical background. As I had indicated, I teach media and popular culture classes. And I think that that's a wonderful way to get a sense of the history of a time period. And I don't know if any of you have ever heard of Frank Luntz. He happens to be a political and business advisor who advises about how language can be used to persuade individuals to support positions or to take actions. So you may be familiar with some of his terms. He was the one who came up with the war on terror rather than the war in Iraq. He was the one who came up with the death tax rather than the estate tax. Very interestingly, there wasn't a whole lot of controversy about an estate tax because basically estate sounds wealthy. But once he changed the language or advised politicians to change the language and they followed his advice to death tax, there was a lot of controversy about the very same policy. Because all of a sudden death is something that we all experience regardless of our economic background. So as you know, language can be used much like a weapon. And I would suggest that the texts we're reading this semester do just that. But I mention this because Frank Luntz talks about how, in his perspective, if you really want to understand a society, you don't really need to know about their education or their religion or their political background. You really need to understand the media that they consume and why. And in this instance, the media of the day would be magazines. And magazines you can think of as an almost kind of pre-internet where they were directed towards specific demographic groups and highly relied on visuals as well as text. And The Cult of True Womanhood is an essay that was written by a media scholar who reviewed women's magazines of the day. And magazines were initially focused on female because the thought was that they had the purchasing decisions within the family, if not the purchasing power. And this would be a wonderful opportunity to advertise to them. And as you probably know, most media vehicles depend heavily on advertising. And by reviewing these media magazines, the scholar found that there were certain themes about what it meant to be a true woman or what it meant to be the ideal female in the 1800s, which came down to 4 attributes. And you can see that below these videos, I am posting our class notes. These are the notes that I would normally post, let's say, on a whiteboard, for instance, if we were meeting in a face-to-face class. And this is in the third section in the second section for The Cult of True Womanhood, that the 4 attributes of true womanhood are piety, in other words, religious observance; purity, in other words, virginity; domesticity, in other words, homemaking; and submissiveness, in other words, passivity. Now, you may probably have had a sense of this prior to reading the essay, but I think this lays a good foundation of the society of the time period in which these authors were writing that we are going to be studying over the course of the semester. And I just wanted to draw your attention to a few quotes. And at the very beginning, it talks about how a woman was a hostage, in effect, to the home and to the ideals associated with homemaking. In fact, the home was oftentimes presented as a kind of prison, or oftentimes felt to be, if nothing else, a kind of prison to female. And the ideal woman, at least according to the way that that was presented by magazines, would have those four cardinal virtues of piety, purity, submissiveness, and domesticity. Piety or religion would be the core of a woman's virtue, the source of her strength, in effect. There's great irony there in that religion, Christianity, promoted the idea of female submissiveness, and through female submissiveness, the idea was that female could gain power because of her connection with God, that she would be, in effect, a kind of better Eve. And that would give her a kind of dignity in her independence. And as such, it was very important that she not be swayed from that. And literary and intellectual pursuits could very easily sway her from that. So literature is a kind of weapon. And we see this in contemporary times when we talk about book banning and some of the concerns associated with how knowledge can basically lead to power and to questioning of the status quo. Um, some have even likened religion to a kind of tranquilizer that would keep women passively at home. And her job was basically to save men from themselves and to raise good Christians and good patriots. So her patriotic duty was not to vote, but basically was be to create either ideal womanhood in her daughters or strong menfolk in her sons. And the college that you might be familiar with that's local, or one of our local colleges, Mount Holyoke, was initially a women's seminary. In fact, Emily Dickinson attended there, and we'll talk a little bit more about that when we read some Emily Dickinson. And its primary goal was to aid women to become religious and ideal female. And Dickinson rebelled against that, which we'll talk about. The second element is purity, that was essential to a woman, that the marriage night was perhaps the single greatest event, and that she should be virginal prior to marriage, and that sexuality was not for pleasure, but it was for procreation. It leads to some of the dichotomies of female that you might have heard of before. The whore or the Madonna being the kind of religious piety that would be expected of female, the whore being any woman who doesn't follow the expectations, especially sexually, of society. And even in today's world, we have two words that both start with the letter S, stud and slut. One is associated with male, one is associated with female, one is associated more positively, and one is associated as more negatively. And I don't think I have to tell you which is which. So many of these elements still exist in our contemporary times. It wasn't that long ago, 1980s, which would have made me a teenager, in effect, or a pre-teenager, when Prince Charles married a Lady Diana. And at the time, she needed to see the royal gynecologist to prove that she was virginal. They examined her hymen. And of course, you know that that isn't any way that you can prove virginity. But I remember this quite clearly in hearing the news outlets talking about this. And the running joke is one of the reasons why Prince Charles chose Diana is because she was so young. She was 19, and the difficulty he would have in finding somebody who was virginal, who would pass the royal gynecological exam, which doesn't exist anymore. But again, the 1980s is within my lifetime. So Going back to texts from the 15 or the 1600s, as I had indicated, I focused on Shakespeare and his contemporaries. You might be familiar with A Midsummer Night's Dream, one of my favorite plays that we study in my Shakespeare class and also my Introduction to Literature class. And I know I have several of you from my Intro to Lit class, so this will seem familiar to you. That in Midsummer Night's Dream, the importance of Hermia, one of the main characters, retaining her virginity, that she basically tells Lysander to lie further off from her. They are both in the woods and they've run away together. And the idea is that she's afraid that he will take advantage of the opportunity of taking her virginity. Keep in mind that from a legal perspective, females couldn't manage property, they couldn't sue in court, they couldn't vote. In fact, it was only until the 1970s that a woman was allowed to take out a credit card in her own name without a male's permission. And I was alive in the 1970s, albeit I was young, but I was still alive. So this happened within my own lifetime. So moving forward, the idea of a loss of virtue not only could lead to a loss of reputation, but it would lead to the idea of madness. It's something that we will talk about a little bit further next class. If a woman managed to withstand a man's assaults, that showed her superiority and power over him. That was part of a woman's role, was to save men from themselves and from their impulses. So a woman's source of power, ironically, was through her chastity. And that said, of course, the greatest event would be marriage for a female and the wedding night, which meant that she would lose that chastity. How's that for contradiction? Dress reform, one of the things that we will talk about over the course of the semester. And of course, attire is very important in terms of presentation. And we still see this today, where oftentimes someone's attire will be used as justification for why that person was perhaps a target for an attack. But think about something like corsets, which could be tied so tightly that they could actually break ribs. Well, it basically limited movement for females, so there was a physical restriction. Even something like today in high heels, that too was very difficult to negotiate. It was in 9/11, and there's also in my lifetime where I remember that after the attacks, the women in the Twin Towers had particular difficulty in fleeing. Everybody did because they were in business attire, which does not lend itself to running. But certainly skirts and high heels are much more difficult to run in than dress shoes and trousers. So again, not that long ago in the overall scheme of things about how dress can oftentimes, or conventions of fashion can oftentimes be used as a way to exert power. A woman should ultimately be submissive, and the idea that that was perhaps the most feminine virtue that a woman could show is her submission. She should never question. And the idea of the chain of being goes all the way back to Shakespeare's time and before, that every being in the universe has a rank and God would be at the very top, and then the angels, and then humans, and man before woman, and adult before child, and so forth. And while the chain of being wasn't necessarily adhered to in the 1800s, there was still this idea that man was superior to female. It's something that is promoted in Christianity and in other religious doctrines as well. This was part of the order of the universe. And that a woman needed a protector, in effect. And there are some physical reasons for that, particularly in our hunter and gatherer days. But of course, with things like industrialization, that becomes less and less important. Whether it was because women are inferior and they need a protector, or they're just different, not necessarily inferior. And that their role was to work, not necessarily in terms of hunting, but for love and affection. And they could achieve that through family. And a woman should be silent unseen and work for pure affection, not for money or ambition. Perhaps you've seen some of the studies that if dollar amounts were to be put on homemaking and basically caretaking, that would be a six-figure salary. But of course, that's unpaid, invisible work, still in our own society. That a woman should have a kind of perpetual childhood because then she was less of a threat if she wouldn't be seen as an equal in effect. And that ultimately the woman should defer to the male, whether that be the father figure or a brother figure initially, and then ultimately a husband figure. A wife should occupy herself with domestic affairs, and that ultimately she should also submit to fortune. Again, another Christian idea: the meek shall inherit the earth, that fate or luck was ultimately her lot. And as we see all of this, plus the focus on domesticity, that her place was in homemaking, and that offered her a kind of security from the world and also protection from some of the temptations of the world. That's not to say that there weren't women who were rebelling against this idea. Now, the idea of female, one of her most important functions being as a kind of nurse or healer, was ironic because being a healer gives a certain level of power. So you can see little ways in which a woman could achieve power, but it was probably through things like the art of the time that women were able to express their dissatisfaction with much of these ideals. And while women were encouraged to engage in hobbies that would be considered appropriate for homemaking, needlework, for instance, flower arranging, letter writing, things of that nature. And I wanted to read this. This is a direct quote. I'm working with the paper copy. This is on page 165. But the quote reads, and this is how the sentence begins. Here she faced a bewildering array of advice. The female was dangerously addicted to novels, according to the literature of the period. She should avoid them, since they interfered with serious piety. If she couldn't help herself and read them anyway, she should choose edifying ones from lists of morally acceptable authors. And I can guarantee you that those were not the texts and are not the texts that we will be reading this semester. That a girl, and I'm reading a little bit further along, could be ruined by a book. The seduction stories regarding exciting and dangerous books were regarded as contributory causes of disaster. The man without honorable intentions always provides the innocent maiden with books as a prelude to his assault on her virtue. Books which attacked or seemed to attack woman's accepted place in society were regarded as equally dangerous, and that women were so susceptible to persuasion. And keep in mind that we're going to be reading a text this semester that is entitled Persuasion, with their gentle, yielding natures, that they might listen to the bold ravings of the hard-featured of their own sex. So when you take all of this into account, it's not surprising that many of the texts that we are reading this semester raised eyebrows. And it also is not surprising that some of the text would be less obviously bold than others. And I think you will see a progression over the course of the semester. I did put the text in chronological order. We are outside of the exception of Kate Chopin's short story, The Story of an Hour, which I wanted to use as an example. And I think you'll see that by the time we get to the ending of the semester, female writers, much like Chopin, are much more bold in their questioning of the role of female. When we begin the semester with texts like Frankenstein, it may not even seem necessarily like a feminist text. And when we talk about Frankenstein, it'll be interesting because Frankenstein falls in a lot of genres. And that ultimately, while we are reading Frankenstein in a women in literature class, I also assigned Frankenstein in my Gothic literature class because it helped to lead to the horror tradition. And it also is assigned in science fiction classes because it can also be read as a science fiction text. So that text is very male centric, and it almost seems as if female is not important. Keep in mind that Mary Shelley, a female author, would have been very aware of the expectations of her time period. And I would say that Frankenstein is very much a feminist text if you read it correctly. And I encourage you to begin reading Frankenstein if you haven't already done so. I've assigned a couple of classes, which is basically a week's worth, for each of the novels that we'll be reading over the course of the semester. But as I had indicated last class, what would be ideal is that if you've read the novel in its entirety before we begin talking about it, then the class discussions and the class attendance questions will make so much more sense. So that if you were continually ahead, in other words, as we are reading Frankenstein, you're reading the next piece, then I think you'll find yourself in a very good place in terms of the semester. And obviously, there were lots of pressures that were going on to lead to reform. It's hard to imagine that the Civil War was going on during this time period when we read these stories, or some of these stories of luxury and privilege, especially when we read something like Persuasion. There, of course, was industrialization, and that was changing the landscape of everything. And of course, there were artists like female authors who were beginning to question the status quo. And that said, I wanted to talk a little bit about a short story just to kind of whet your appetite for the readings that we'll be doing over the course of the semester. The Story of an Hour. And I've included a link for that, and it also is included in the text I ordered for Kate Chopin. And those of you who are returning students of mine, then you know that we would have reviewed this story in Introduction to Literature. Written in 1894 by Kate Chopin. Kate Chopin is probably best known for her novella The Awakening, which is how we will be ending this semester. And the Story of an Hour gives you the example of a life-changing hour. So it literally is a story of an hour. And it's a page and a half long or so, but it is filled with so much depth and sophistication. And I've oftentimes argued that perhaps the short story is much more difficult to write than the novel. With the novel, you've got hundreds of pages to develop a character. And if perhaps some of your writing is a bit weaker, you can forgive that in the context of the whole. That wouldn't necessarily be the case with something that's a page and a half long, where every word has to count. And what we've got in The Story of an Hour is the story of a Mrs. Mallard. And of course, when we are reading, not just for content, but we're reading for analysis, we're trying to determine what the author was probably trying to do with some of their language. Even if the author isn't consciously aware of something, they might have subconsciously have put meaning. So the idea that our main character is named Mallard, which is the name of a bird, a common duck, it seems to have significance, especially if you know anything about Kate Chopin, because she oftentimes talks about birds representing female. In fact, bird was a slang term that was used for female, and that a bird could be entrapped in a cage, but a bird could also spread its wings and fly. Keep that in mind when we get to our last text, The Awakening. And I do a little exercise in my literature class where we talk a little bit about mallards, which are ducks. They're very common. And one might say that Mrs. Mallard's experience is a common experience. And another point, there are many points about mallards, is that the female is rather dull, and it's the male that has colorful feathers. And we could say that also illustrates the idea of how male and female are treated in society, that it's the female who isn't given much attention, but it's the male who is, or given power and control in society. She's known as Mrs. in the beginning of the story, and that small detail is so important because she's seen as property in effect. Obviously, even in today's world, the surname oftentimes changes when a female marries and she takes on the male surname. That would have definitely been the convention of this time period. So she takes on her husband's name. No, her husband, Brentley Mallard, is given a first name and a last name. So he's given an identity in a way that she isn't. And that's part of the story, is that she does not have identity. And we're told that she has initially heart trouble. It's only at the ending of the story that they talk about heart disease. And there is a distinction between the two, because the heart is oftentimes associated with emotions. So there's a little bit of foreshadowing here, and the assumption that the language of trouble is used rather than disease to show that she has a troubled heart or a sad heart. And the idea is that it's probably because of her marriage in the 1800s, because we see all these symbols of freedom when she's told that her husband has died in a train accident. And at first she's overcome with emotion, and then what she does is she goes by herself, which would have been seen as quite unusual for the time period. That would be seen even as somewhat dangerous, that a woman would be spending time alone, because who knew what kind of trouble she could get into. And when she's in this room by herself, she's looking through an open window. Windows are an avenue for the outside world. Again, the female would be limited to the inside as opposed to the outside. The fact that it's an open window shows expansiveness, the possibility of opportunity. She's sitting in a roomy armchair. An armchair is for one person, not for two. Now that she's a widow, she can basically no longer have to share things the way one would with the sofa or a love seat. The fact that it's roomy and comfortable, again, all of these are positive associations about her new status, even though she may not even consciously realize this. She's looking at an open square outside. It happens to be spring. The seasons are oftentimes used as stages of life or to represent emotions, and spring can represent renewal, rebirth, renewal. There are birds flying outside. Again, Chopin likes her bird imagery, sparrows in this instance. And while there's rain, something that could be seen as a negative, of course, rain can be positive, because rain or water provides life. And the idea of washing away the past, or washing away the elements of oppression that she might have experienced within marriage for a new beginning. After all, the skies are beginning to show blue. Again, this is all positive. And there's even reference to the West. And in a short story, if piece is that short, probably just about everything is important. So you could think about the sun rising or the sun setting in the west. And of course, this could be the ending of something for her. And the idea is that there will be a sunrise and there will be a beginning. Or you could think of something like westward expansion, which was also happening during the time period. And that she was young, which is what you would not expect necessarily for somebody with heart disease or heart trouble, but repressed. So there's all of this foreshadowing or little clues about the fact that marriage is basically entrapment for her. Even though this isn't necessarily something she wants to immediately accept, she feels something creeping towards her. There's some negative associations with creeping. And then she says outright, free, 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 body and soul free. So we've got the evidence right there in the quote that she feels free, because she actually says it. And she talks about how she loved her husband, albeit sometimes. And if you've ever loved somebody, you know how you can love them sometimes. And that he had kind and tender hands that never looked save with love upon her. The idea isn't that the husband mistreated her, or even that she was in a bad marriage. It's more about the institution of marriage and what it might mean in the 1800s for female, a lack of freedom and power and autonomy, as we saw in the Cult of True Womanhood. That now, as a widow, she could live for herself. And widowhood offered a unique opportunity for female, especially if heirs weren't present. And notice we aren't given any reference to Mrs. Mallard having children. The idea is she would inherit the estate, and that would give her economic power, which means that she wouldn't necessarily have to remarry. It's one of the reasons we think that Queen Elizabeth during Shakespeare's time never married, because she would have lost her power, both economic and political. So she was known as the Virgin Queen because she never had heirs, which led to all kinds of political difficulties later, since the crown was basically passed from generation to generation. And now there wasn't a direct correlation for the transfer of power in Queen Elizabeth's time. But even still, if you think about some of the statistics from the 1800s, and of course, statistics are complicated things, but there was definitely a higher rate of remarriage amongst male widowers during the time period than there was from female widowers. And there could be many reasons for that. But I suspect that one of them had to be that marriage didn't necessarily have to be an economic union, which was very common during Shakespeare's time and even in the 1800s, as we will see with Persuasion as well. And that now if Mrs. Mallard has some level of economic independence, and she also has a certain level of status as a widow, so she wouldn't be seen as an old maid, which would be seen as a kind of negative in society. Well, she could remain as a widow. This is something we'll directly talk about when we read Persuasion. And this excites her that now that she can live for herself. One of my favorite quotes in the text is that there would be no powerful will bending hers in that blind persistence with which men and women believe they have a right to impose a private will upon a fellow creature. And the reason why I like this quote is because it mentions both men and women. And usually this text is read from the female perspective. It's written by a female author. Our main character is female. And it's about the role of oppression in marriage for female. Yes. But this quote, no powerful will bending hers in that blind persistence with which men and women believe they have a right to impose a private will upon a fellow creature, expands the idea beyond female to the institution of marriage as a whole. And of course, it's quite telling that the assumption is that marriage is a heterosexual social institution, which would have been expected during that particular time period. And she thinks about spring days ahead of her and summer days ahead of her. Again, times of the season that are all associated with positives. But at the end, it turns out that there was a terrible mistake and her husband isn't dead at all, now that she's become to get excited over the possibility of being a widow and being single. And when her husband, Brentley, walks through the door, she's so overcome that she dies of, quote, joy that kills, unquote. And the assumption by the doctors and the family is that she's so overjoyed with seeing her husband. And she did love him, albeit sometimes. But we know something that the other characters don't because we spend time alone with Mrs. Mallard in that room. And that we know that she also experiences probably despair over the fact that she's losing freedom now that her husband has returned. Something that the other characters don't at all anticipate or expect, but we know as reader. And if you've taken my literature class, you know that there are a series of questions in our textbook about this very short story that I'm quite fond of, because these questions illustrate how subjective literary analysis can be. Or as I had a very wise professor in college once say, that there are no wrong answers. Or there are no right answers. There are no right answers in literature, but there are some wrong ones. In other words, as long as you could support your position with evidence from the text, that's considered a, quote, right, unquote answer, whether intentional by the author or not. A wrong answer is something that you can't support with evidence from the text. But some of the questions in our textbook at the end about this story are, do you find Mrs. Mallard to be sympathetic? Some readers think she's callous and selfish, unnatural, even monstrous, because she revels in her newly discovered sense of freedom so soon after learning of her husband's death. Others read her as a victim of her inability to control her own life in a repressive, male-dominated society. Is it possible to hold both views simultaneously? Are your views in any way influenced by your being male or female? Does your age affect your perception? What about your social and economic background? Does your nationality, race, or religion in any way shape your attitudes? Do you have particular views about the institution of marriage that inform your assessment? And do you have other reading experiences, perhaps a familiarity with some of Chopin's other stories that have predisposed you one way or another? All readers have bias. We want to acknowledge our bias. And of course, authors have bias as well, and we want to acknowledge their bias. And literature is really an examination of the human condition. Humans are filled with contradiction. And that's what you are going to see when you read these texts, that they are filled with contradiction. This is probably the closest we'll ever get to really understanding what it might have been like to be a woman in the 1800s by reading these female authors. And of course, we can't have the same experiences, but this is as close as perhaps we can get when we're reading the literature of the time and experiencing through reading what the characters are experiencing. Or if you've ever had that wonderful sensation when you're reading and you forget that you're reading, that you're so absorbed in the story. So the story of an hour gives you a little bit of an idea of some of the writing that would have been going on and some of the ways that the cult of true womanhood was being questioned by female authors and some of the ways that you could go about reading carefully. Obviously, the cult of true womanhood is not a piece of literature in the way the short story is the story of an hour. So next class, I wanted to talk a little bit more about the role of female. I wanted to talk about your first paper and give you some suggested paper topics. And I also wanted to talk about Frankenstein as well. So now is the time to start reading if you haven't already done so. Your attendance question for this video and today's class, which would be due Thursday, the 30th, on our discussion forum. And if you need additional time, please let me know. Is, did you like or dislike Chopin's ending of The Joy That Kills in the story of an hour, and why? And obviously, there's no right or wrong answer. I'm interested more in your reasoning. You don't need to start a new discussion thread to answer this, and you're not required to respond to your classmates, only if you're moved to do so. As if we were in a face-to-face class, if you were moved to respond to someone's response in class, you could do so. You're not required to, but you are required to read everybody's responses and my responses that'll follow in turn. That'll give you a good idea of what we would have done during the second part of this class in our class discussion if we were meeting in a face-to-face class. So I hope you're all doing well. I'm doing well, and we will continue on next class with, well, Frankenstein, and also a little bit of more information about upcoming assignments. Take care. Bye-bye.